It was a morning of unremarkable tranquillity in Flaxborough. The sun had just begun to coax a mild warmth from the town's cobbled streets, and the market square was, as usual, a tableau of polite bustle. Mrs. Turpin arranging the flower stall with an exactitude bordering on militaristic, Mr. Hollingsworth grumbling at the quality of the new town council notices, and the occasional dog barking in a proprietorial manner at any passer-by who dared to approach too closely. Into this quietly orchestrated scene arrived a stranger whose presence was noted more for its subtle disruption than any overt intrusion. He appeared, quite simply, at the edge of the square, carrying a small, leather-bound case and wearing a coat that suggested neither poverty nor conspicuous wealth, but rather a careful avoidance of attention. He had the look of someone who had passed through many towns and judged them all as temporary inconveniences. The first to notice him was Mrs. Turpin, who, after arranging her dahlias, instinctively marked the stranger as untrustworthy, a designation that in Flaxborough was not given lightly. "He doesn't seem like the sort who buys begonias," she remarked to the butcher's apprentice, whose eyes were fixed upon a particularly unruly cabbage. "No, not a begonia man," he said, and in that brief exchange the seed of gossip was sown. The stranger lingered near the fountain, apparently observing the slow ripple of water with an air of mild curiosity. By mid-morning he had visited the bakery, the newsagent, and the town library, leaving behind nothing but faintly polite nods and a hint of unease. One could not say he intruded, yet the town seemed to notice him all the same, as if the air itself were a little less familiar. It was at the railway buffet, however, that his arrival truly entered the town's social consciousness. Flaxborough's buffet was modest, an array of tea, scones, and the occasional meat pie, but it served as the town's unofficial gossip exchange. The stranger ordered nothing more elaborate than a cup of tea, and then, with a calm attention to detail, inspected the menu cards in a manner that suggested curiosity rather than hunger. He left no footprints in the dusty linoleum other than those his shoes marked upon approach and departure, yet his presence provoked subtle alarm. He occupied a chair without asking, glanced briefly at the morning papers, and, above all, gave the impression of watching and remembering. By noon, the subject of the man with no apparent reason for being here had permeated several conversations. The vicar expressed mild concern to the undertaker, who replied that all newcomers were suspect until proven dull. Mr. Flax, a solicitor with a penchant for office gossip, was already imagining motives of the most improbable sorts, inheritance disputes, secret visitations, or perhaps espionage of the sort he had once read about in the daily papers, though he admitted he had never encountered anything resembling actual espionage in Flaxborough itself. It was, naturally, Inspector Purbright, who remained quietly observant. Seated in his office above the police station, he made no note of the stranger on the public boards, nor did he interrupt the steady flow of his paperwork. Yet he allowed the reports of locals' observations to reach him with that polite patience for which he was known. Every remark, whether tinged with fear or amusement, found its way into his mental ledger, the careful order of Mrs. Turpin's flowers, the butcher's apprentice's erratic cabbage judgment, the vicar's mild consternation. All of it mattered. When Sergeant Baskerville entered the office, slightly flushed from climbing the stairs, he carried with him the first curious detail. "Sir," he said, setting down a small envelope, "I had a word with Miss Pettigrew at the bakery. She says the gentleman, well, he asked 3 questions about local residents, and then after paying he just left. No farewell, no comment, nothing. Miss Pettigrew finds it unsettling." Purbright raised a brow. 3 questions, you say?" "Yes, sir." And they were quite specific. About the doctor's visiting hours, the History Society, and Mr. Flax's office hours. A quiet smile touched Purbright's lips. The questions were innocent enough in themselves, but the combination was oddly pointed. The man's presence was not yet a matter for alarm, but it was, by Flaxborough standards, certainly curious. "Baskerville," Purbright said, folding his hands neatly atop the desk, "we shall do nothing hasty. Observe, as we always do, and keep a note of anyone else who notices him. We may yet discover that our visitor is nothing more than a tourist with a fondness for tea and an interest in the minutiae of small-town life. Or we may find, eventually, that even the most polite of strangers can rattle the delicate scaffolding of our little society." Outside, the fountain continued to bubble, the flower stall remained immaculate, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked at nothing at all. The stranger, having completed his circumnavigation of the square, disappeared into a side street, leaving behind the faintest disturbance, a question mark rather than an exclamation. And in Flaxborough, a question mark was often the prelude to a story. By mid-afternoon, the stranger's visit had evolved from a curious novelty into a subtle ripple across the social consciousness of Flaxborough. The market square hummed with speculation, as each observation seemed to build upon the last, forming a mosaic of half-truths and quiet anxieties. Mrs. Turpin, her fingers perpetually stained with soil, now whispered to the butcher's apprentice that the man might be a detective, or worse, someone collecting information for the council. The apprentice, whose imagination often outpaced his reasoning, nodded solemnly, convinced that espionage was afoot. At the library, the librarian, Miss Penhaligon, found herself particularly unsettled. The stranger had lingered among the town records and archives, tracing his fingers lightly over the spines of books as if absorbing details by osmosis. He asked questions about past property disputes and the founding members of the local horticultural society, all delivered in a tone so polite it almost disarmed suspicion. Miss Penhaligon, however, could not shake the sense that these questions were not idle. She confided her unease to Mr. Flax later in the day, who in turn passed the information along to the vicar, adding a flourish of conjecture about possible motives connected to hidden inheritances. Purbright, meanwhile, had maintained his quiet vigilance. He instructed Baskerville to make discreet inquiries with those who had encountered the stranger directly, emphasizing subtlety over immediacy. "We must allow the town to reveal its own truths," Purbright said, "and the stranger will, in his way, tell us what we need to know without our prompting." By early evening, the stranger had returned to the railway buffet for a second brief appearance, choosing the same chair he had occupied that morning. His gaze swept the room, noting the familiar faces of the postman, a pair of elderly men playing chess in a corner, and the clerk from the solicitor's office who had lingered to observe him earlier. He made no overt interaction, yet his presence alone prompted murmured commentary. One might have thought, to an outside observer, that a minor celebrity had entered the town. So thickly did the hum of speculation settle over the buffet. It was here that the first tangible oddity emerged. Miss Pettigrew, the bakery assistant, who had spoken to Baskerville that morning, approached the buffet with her notebook in hand. She had been noting small details of the stranger's movements for her own amusement, a habit of hers that bordered on obsessive. As she reached his table, she noticed something peculiar, a footprint in the dust near the buffet's back entrance. Not a fresh mark, nor one easily visible from the main room, but a faint, almost imperceptible impression in the linoleum, showing the heel of a shoe slightly worn on one side. Miss Pettigrew mentioned it to Baskerville, who dutifully reported the observation to Purbright. The inspector, upon hearing the description, did not display surprise. "A footprint," he said softly, "yet one that seems designed to vanish. Interesting indeed." He made a note of it, though he understood, as always, that significance was rarely immediate. It was the pattern over time that revealed character, intent, and occasionally mischief. Throughout the day, the town's reaction continued to evolve. By evening, the vicar had consulted with the undertaker about the stranger's intentions. Mr. Flax had drafted a speculative memorandum for no recipient in particular, and Mrs. Turpin had decided the man's interest in her dahlias was deeply suspicious. Each new account, however embellished or distorted, added pieces to the silent puzzle that Purbright observed with patient detachment. As dusk settled, the stranger left the town square by the side street through which he had first appeared. His departure was as unremarkable as his arrival, leaving behind only the faint echo of careful movement and a heightened attentiveness among those who had noticed him. Purbright, sitting quietly at his desk, reviewed the reports collected throughout the day, making subtle connections that no one else could yet see. The specific questions asked, the slight irregularity in the footprint, and the pattern of appearances that corresponded almost eerily with the routines of certain town figures. "It is not the stranger himself who unsettles the town," Purbright mused to Baskerville, who had been dutifully taking notes. "It is what he illuminates in the townspeople, their curiosities, their secret resentments, and the unnoticed small acts that define the rhythm of daily life. And within that illumination lies the key, if one observes with patience." Thus, the town settled into evening, carrying its minor anxieties home, while the stranger's quiet presence lingered like a shadow over Flaxborough's otherwise orderly streets. The stage was set, each detail in place, and Purbright's mind worked silently, assembling the threads that would, in time, reveal the truth behind the man who left no footprints. The following morning, Flaxborough awoke with its usual civility, though a few lingering conversations betrayed the town's continued preoccupation with the stranger. Mrs. Turpin had spoken at length to the postman, who reported that the man had, quite deliberately, paused near the vicarage gate as if inspecting the building's features. The vicar himself, unaware of this silent scrutiny, found his day subtly altered by the knowledge that someone might be cataloguing even the most innocuous aspects of his parish. Purbright, seated at his desk with a careful cup of tea, considered these details with his customary patience. The reports were fragmentary, an almost imperceptible footprint here, a momentary pause there, but each carried significance when woven together. He instructed Baskerville to accompany him on a series of informal interviews, not as interrogations, but as polite conversations designed to observe rather than provoke. Their first call was to the bakery. Miss Pettigrew, still clutching her notebook, greeted them with mild suspicion. "Inspector, I've been noting his habits," she began, eager to display her diligence. Purbright allowed her to speak freely, interjecting only the occasional neutral prompt. He observed the rhythm of her speech, the slight tension in her hands, and the subtle embellishments she added to her account. Each hesitation and inflection revealed more about her perception than about the stranger himself. Next, they visited the library, where Miss Penhaligon repeated her observations with a slightly different emphasis. Here, Purbright noted the librarian's pride in her archival knowledge and the faint defensive edge in her voice when she mentioned the stranger's questions. Baskerville took mental notes, and Purbright, while listening, gently cross-referenced the observations against what Miss Pettigrew had said. Contradictions were minor, almost imperceptible, yet they were precisely the threads from which the truth might eventually be drawn. By mid-morning they made their way to Mr. Flax's office. The solicitor was visibly perturbed, adjusting his spectacles and shuffling papers as he spoke. "It is, in my opinion, quite irregular for a stranger to inquire so closely into the private affairs of this town," he said. "Why, he asked me about the property records for the old Hargreaves estate." "I can assure you, Inspector, I have not disclosed anything of the sort to anyone." Purbright nodded with polite interest, noting the mixture of indignation and anxiety in the solicitor's tone. It was the sort of measured concern that suggested he might know more than he was consciously revealing. Each encounter revealed something small yet significant. A repeated question here, a fleeting glance there, the almost imperceptible way someone hesitated before answering. Purbright was particularly attentive to the subtleties. Miss Pettigrew's insistence on recording details, Miss Penhaligon's slight defensiveness, Mr. Flax's careful phrasing. To any casual observer, these were trivial reactions, but to a mind trained in human nature and small-town behaviour, they formed an invisible lattice of motives, deceptions and anxieties. By the afternoon, Purbright returned to the station, asking Baskerville to collate the various observations into a summary. "It is less the stranger himself than the town's response that interests me," he remarked. "Notice the tiny dissonances, who speaks first, who embellishes, who hesitates. These are the footprints that matter." Baskerville nodded, slightly perplexed, though he trusted his inspector's insight implicitly. Later, a brief walk through the square confirmed that the stranger had once again passed quietly among the familiar faces. He paused only long enough to nod to Mrs. Turpin, who insisted afterward that the gesture carried a certain inscrutable meaning. No transaction occurred, no document exchanged, no overt communication beyond those polite, measured gestures. Yet the cumulative effect of repeated visits, of unobtrusive observation, and of subtle attention to the town's routines was undeniable. As dusk approached, Purbright sat at his desk reviewing his mental notes. Every subtle hesitation, every polite question, every seemingly trivial observation by the townspeople was filed carefully. The stranger remained an enigma, but within the careful patterns of his movements and the reactions they provoked, Purbright could already perceive the contours of an underlying design. And, as always, the key would lie not in a dramatic confrontation or forensic revelation, but in the gentle, almost invisible interplay of character, habit, and expectation. In the quiet of the police office, he finally allowed himself a faint, knowing smile. Flaxborough, he thought, was a town of ordinary rhythms and discreet secrets, and a stranger with no footprints could, with patience and subtlety, reveal more about its citizens than anyone could anticipate. By the following morning, the stranger's presence had achieved a form of notoriety in Flaxborough that was quietly competitive. Conversations at the post office, the bakery, and the library had all converged on a single, recurring notion. The man was up to something, though nobody could agree precisely what. Mr. Flax, ever fond of tidy conclusions, had already formulated a likely explanation. "It is undoubtedly some scheme involving the old Hargreaves estate," he declared to the vicar, who listened with mild incredulity. "A claim, a survey, or some legal manoeuvre. I cannot imagine he would trouble himself with idle curiosity alone." Mrs. Turpin, conversely, saw a darker, almost theatrical purpose. "He eyes everything with intent," she told the butcher's apprentice. "Even the flowers. I would not be surprised if he were a spy, or worse. By mid-morning, the town's speculation had hardened into a semi-consensus, a single culprit for the disturbance, a neat explanation that, if accepted, allowed the community to resume its familiar rhythms. Purbright, however, remained quietly observant. While the town leaned toward the tidy conclusion, he continued his own inquiries, noting discrepancies that others had overlooked. He revisited Miss Pettigrew, who had now catalogued multiple minor observations. The stranger's careful avoidance of certain streets, the way he lingered near the solicitor's office yet never entered, and a faint scratch on the leather case he carried that suggested recent, perhaps hurried, travel. Each detail was minor on its own, but collectively they hinted at purpose beyond simple curiosity. Later, he called upon Mr. Flax directly, ostensibly, to follow up on the solicitor's earlier concerns. "Your observation about the Hargreaves estate is interesting, Mr. Flax," Purbright said, his tone polite but probing. "Might you recall any recent disputes or unexpected visitors related to the property?" The solicitor considered, frowning slightly. "Well, there was a minor disagreement over a boundary line last month, but surely that is of no consequence to a visitor like—" He paused, adjusting his spectacles. "To someone unknown, or is it?" Purbright allowed the implication to hang, noting the subtle unease that crept into the solicitor's otherwise controlled demeanour. He refrained from pressing, content to let the man reveal more by his own responses. Baskerville, ever loyal but sometimes impatient, suggested questioning the gardener or the vicar further, but Purbright demurred. "We must observe first," he said. "There is merit in silence as a tool for revelation." By mid-afternoon, a peculiar pattern had emerged. The stranger had made a brief visit to the library and then to the railway buffet, as if retracing his previous steps, yet he avoided locations where he had been noted before. Purbright, walking unobtrusively behind him at a respectful distance, noticed the deliberate care with which he navigated the town, avoiding puddles, stepping precisely where the footprints of the previous day had not been disturbed and pausing only in places that permitted discreet observation of others. It was, in a subtle way, a choreography that spoke of preparation, attention, and caution. That evening, reports trickled in from various townspeople, each adding a layer to the emerging picture. Miss Penhaligon mentioned a previously unnoticed detail, a small, almost imperceptible mark on the corner of a ledger that the stranger had handled. Mrs. Turpin commented on the unusual arrangement of flowers in the market square that morning, claiming it didn't seem quite right. Even the vicar, who rarely speculated, remarked that the stranger's gaze seemed to linger longer than polite interest required, as though cataloguing more than appearances. Purbright sat in his office reviewing each report. The town had eagerly embraced the simplicity of assigning blame or explanation, yet the reality, he observed, was more subtle. The first obvious suspect, the neat, tidy explanation involving the solicitor and the old Hargreaves estate, was attractive to the public mind but failed to account for the minor but persistent anomalies. The strategic avoidance of streets, the faint leather scratch, the precise and repeated pauses. Each clue suggested that the stranger's purpose was not merely legal, nor was it impulsive. "The town will lean toward tidy resolutions," Purbright remarked to Baskerville, who had been quietly noting his own thoughts. "But the truth rarely conforms to the neat patterns we wish to see. Our visitor leaves footprints in the subtleties of behavior, in reactions rather than evidence. We must follow those signs before we reach any conclusion." As dusk settled and the town returned to its customary rhythm, the stranger vanished once more into a side street, leaving behind nothing but the faintest traces of his measured presence. Flaxborough's citizens, content with their preliminary theories, felt a measure of closure, yet Purbright knew that patience and close observation would reveal more than speculation ever could. The first obvious suspect, while convenient for gossip, had not yet warranted his judgment, and within the quiet minutiae of the day lay the seeds of understanding that only time and careful attention could bring to light. Late one afternoon, as Purbright reviewed his notes in the quiet of the station, a seemingly trivial observation arrived in the form of a visitor's comment. Mrs. Turpin had called, not with a complaint, but with a minor detail that at first glance appeared inconsequential. A single letter, half hidden beneath a flower pot on the market stall, had been moved slightly since morning. "I thought nothing of it at the time," she said earnestly, "but when I looked again this afternoon it was nearer the edge, almost as if someone had nudged it." Purbright listened with polite attentiveness, noting the hesitation in her voice as she added, Of course, it may mean nothing. People do brush against things, don't they? Indeed, most would have dismissed it as the random accident of an inattentive customer. But Purbright, whose attention was attuned to subtleties, immediately recognized the potential significance. A small act, unnoticed by many, could betray intent or mark the presence of someone meticulous in observation. He instructed Baskerville to revisit the market square in the early evening, ostensibly to oversee general policing, but in fact to observe who approached the flower stall and in what manner. Baskerville returned an hour later, reporting a stranger's measured steps and the faintest glance toward the letter, before continuing along the square without pause. Nothing overt, yet everything suggestive, a deliberate attention, a discreet interaction with an object otherwise deemed trivial. Over the next few days, Purbright quietly expanded his inquiries, revisiting Miss Pettigrew, Miss Penhaligon, and even the vicar, noting inconsistencies in what had been previously reported. Each conversation, innocuous in appearance, revealed slight variations, a forgotten mention here, a cautious rephrasing there, all pointing toward a pattern of observation that few had consciously registered. The footprint anomaly, the leather case's scratch, and now the nudged letter converged into an intricate web of minor yet telling clues. As evening fell on the fifth day, Purbright noticed another subtle irregularity. The stranger, observed near the library, paused not at the bookshelves, but at the window facing the street, as if measuring or recording something external. He lingered long enough to attract the attention of Mr. Flax, who later described the event with exaggerated indignation, claiming the man's behavior was improper, even suspicious. Purbright, however, recognized it as another of the small gestures that often preceded larger revelations, an undramatic act that, with patience, spoke volumes. By now, the town had settled into an uneasy rhythm. Citizens whispered about the stranger, yet the neat conclusion favoured by gossip, the Hargreaves estate dispute, had not been disproven, only complicated. Purbright, reflecting privately, considered the town itself, its pride in order, its sensitivity to intrusion, and its insistence on assigning blame where none had yet been confirmed. It was within this framework, he knew, that the stranger's presence functioned as both catalyst and mirror, revealing latent anxieties and unspoken grudges. That evening he sat in his office, reviewing the sequence of minor but telling events, the precise footprint, the adjusted letter, the careful scrutiny of the streets, and the repeated polite pauses in public spaces. Each by itself was meaningless, but together they sketched a design, subtle and deliberate, which only careful attention could elucidate. Purbright allowed himself a faint smile, recognizing that the investigation was entering its next phase, one in which the interplay between observation and human reaction would soon reveal the truth, if approached with patience, courtesy, and a careful eye for the small yet telling details that Flaxborough so often overlooked. Over the following days, Flaxborough's quiet routines began to reveal subtle disturbances. It was not that anything dramatic had occurred, but the town's small grievances and concealed habits were slowly being exposed by the stranger's methodical presence. At the post office, the clerk noted a repeated, lingering glance toward a stack of undelivered letters. At the cafe, one of the waitresses observed him taking careful note of who entered and left, down to the precise time of day. Nothing overtly criminal, yet a faint tension threaded through the observations, enough to unsettle the town's previously unflappable surface. Purbright, as ever, remained quietly observant. He visited the outskirts of the town, speaking politely with the gardener of the Hargreaves estate, who mentioned a minor theft of bulbs from the greenhouse weeks earlier. "Nothing worth reporting, really," the man said with a shrug that betrayed both embarrassment and a touch of unease. Purbright listened, noting the subtle inflection. The gardener's manner suggested more than mere oversight. Perhaps he had seen or heard something, but was reluctant to articulate it fully. Meanwhile, other townspeople revealed themselves in small ways. Miss Penhaligon confessed, almost sheepishly, that she had noticed a discrepancy in the library's ledger. A book had been marked returned when it was still missing. Mrs. Turpin mentioned a petty rivalry with the neighbouring flower stall owner who had accused her of subtle sabotage over the arrangement of plants. Mr. Flax quietly admitted a dispute with a distant cousin concerning property lines, though he insisted it was a matter of no significance. These fragments, mundane on the surface, collectively formed a lattice of human motives and tensions. Purbright's mind, trained to read between the polite facades, recognized the interconnections. A town of civil order, yes, but threaded with rivalries, hidden annoyances and minor disputes that could easily be leveraged by someone attentive enough. The stranger's pattern of observation now suggested he was cataloguing these very threads, watching the minor fissures beneath Flaxborough's genteel exterior. Late in the afternoon, as Purbright walked past the market square, he observed the stranger once more, pausing briefly to glance toward the vicarage before disappearing down a narrow lane. The inspector noted how deliberately he moved, avoiding the obvious paths and yet somehow always remaining in contact with the town's rhythm. Each small gesture, the tilt of a head, a slight pause, a discreet survey of a window, spoke of a quiet, almost surgical attention to the town's underlying social dynamics. Back at the station, Purbright reviewed his notes. He could see now that the investigation had expanded naturally. The stranger's presence had coaxed forth the small grievances, the minor secrets, and the subtle hypocrisies that Flaxborough's citizens normally kept carefully tucked away. It was in these details, rather than any overt crime, that the truth would reveal itself. Each person had, perhaps unknowingly, disclosed a fragment of the story through their reactions, their hesitation, or their careful speech. Baskerville, peering over his shoulder, asked, "Do you think he's here for something in particular, sir, or merely observing?" Purbright smiled faintly, tapping a finger against his notebook. "Observing, yes. But observation in this town is never idle. It is the subtle interplay of people, their grudges, their vanities, their private routines, that forms the evidence we seek. And it is only by understanding these patterns that we can uncover what the stranger intends and why he came at all." As dusk fell, Flaxborough's streets regained their familiar calm, though the air carried a slightly heightened attentiveness. The town had revealed more of itself than usual, and Purbright, in the quiet of his office, recognized that patience, careful scrutiny, and the interplay of human nature were guiding him steadily toward a solution. The stage was set, the players quietly positioned, and the moment of revelation, though still distant, was approaching with the inevitability of subtle, well-measured steps. The calm of Flaxborough was interrupted the following morning by a discovery that, while minor in itself, shifted the tenor of the ongoing observation. A package, small and unremarkable, had been left at the railway buffet, addressed to no one in particular, wrapped neatly in brown paper, and sealed with a simple string. Miss Pettigrew, who had arrived early to prepare the counter for the day, noticed it first. Its placement, slightly askew on the sideboard, caught her attention precisely because it was out of sequence with the usual routine. Purbright, informed by Baskerville, approached the scene with his customary blend of politeness and scrutiny. The package had no fingerprints, no immediate identifying marks beyond the faint impression of a name, written in the most careful of scripts, and yet its very presence suggested deliberation. The town's attention, previously fixed on speculation about the stranger himself, now turned to the object he had apparently left behind, or perhaps to someone else entirely. Interviews with those who had been present in the buffet the previous day revealed further inconsistencies. The postman claimed he had seen the stranger near the establishment early in the morning, but swore he had not delivered anything. Miss Penhaligon remembered a fleeting movement in the street outside the library window, as if someone had transferred a parcel under cover of observation. Each account, polite and deferential, contained slight variations that hinted at something more than mere coincidence. The contents of the package, once carefully opened, under Purbright's guidance, were equally perplexing. A series of documents, meticulously typed and annotated, detailed local property lines, past council disputes, and minor grievances, all compiled with an exacting precision that suggested intimate knowledge of the town's private affairs. Nothing illegal appeared at first glance, yet the scope and accuracy of the material implied a deliberate act of cataloguing, a subtle intrusion into the private rhythms of Flaxborough life. Purbright noted how the second incident, the package, had shifted attention. The neat assumption regarding the Hargreaves estate and the stranger's supposed legal interest now seemed insufficient to account for the careful, wide-ranging observations recorded within the papers. It was no longer a matter of a single curious visitor. There was method, and method implied purpose. The town, previously comfortable in its tidy narrative, began to murmur about the possibility of espionage or hidden motives, even as Purbright's own mind turned calmly over the evidence, mapping patterns where others saw only details. By evening, he had spoken to several townspeople who were directly implicated in the documents, the solicitor, the gardener, and the vicar. Their reactions, polite but tinged with unease, offered a wealth of insight. Mr. Flax noted the accuracy of the property descriptions with a faint flush of discomfort. The gardener hesitated when asked about the greenhouse bulbs, and the vicar's curiosity about the precise notation of church records betrayed a slight personal stake he had not previously disclosed. Each response, measured and outwardly civil, revealed cracks in the facades that Purbright had been carefully observing from the outset. In the quiet of the station later that evening, he reviewed the accumulated patterns. The first obvious suspect, the tidy explanation of an estate dispute, was no longer sufficient. The second incident had expanded the field. More townspeople, more grievances, and a broader array of secrets now demanded attention. The stranger had catalyzed these revelations, but it was the interplay of human nature, careful observation, and minor indulgences in pride and secrecy that held the key. Purbright, as ever, allowed the town's reactions to illuminate the truth, confident that patience and a keen eye for subtle behavioral cues would eventually expose what had remained hidden beneath Flaxborough's polite exterior. As the week progressed, Purbright found himself increasingly absorbed not by overt action, but by reflection. In the quiet of his office, he traced the subtle currents that the stranger had stirred in Flaxborough. Minor resentments made audible, petty rivalries revealed in small hesitations, and the careful guarding of secrets that every respectable citizen considered theirs alone. The pattern was not in dramatic gestures or public scandal, but in the tiny, almost imperceptible ways people revealed themselves when confronted with an observer who disturbed their accustomed order. He considered Mrs. Turpin's quick judgments, the florist's unvoiced anxieties, the solicitor's careful phrasing, and the vicar's discreet concern over trivial records. Each had reacted not to a tangible threat, but to the invisible spotlight cast upon their routines. Purbright reflected on the nature of human behavior. Civility and politeness, he noted, often conceal as much as they reveal, yet under careful observation, even these subtle cues betray priorities, motives, and the faintest traces of unease. The second incident, the package in the railway buffet, had crystallized his thoughts. It was a physical manifestation of the stranger's quiet intent, yet it was also a mirror held up to the town itself. By cataloguing grievances, minor disputes, and small peculiarities, the visitor had forced Flaxborough's citizens to reveal themselves, unself-consciously, in ways they would not have otherwise. Purbright recognized that his own task was to follow these indirect signals, reading between the lines of politeness, hesitation, and careful speech. He reviewed his notes on the footprint, the nudged letter, the repeated pauses, and the attentive gazes. Each, he realized, was a form of communication, unspoken yet deliberate. The stranger had provoked responses, and those responses contained the clues he required. Every minor inconsistency, every slight embellishment, every almost forgotten detail formed a lattice of evidence. It was, as always, less about direct action and more about the subtle interplay of character, habit, and societal expectation. Baskerville, who had been quietly cataloguing observations alongside him, ventured a question. "Sir, do you think the man intends harm, or is it simply curiosity?" Purbright allowed himself a faint smile, replying gently, "Observation is rarely neutral. Here, the town's own habits, vanities, and minor indulgences have been brought to the fore. The truth lies not only in what he does, but in how others reveal themselves in response. That is often more instructive than any act of violence or overt mischief." As dusk fell, the town streets regained their customary rhythm. The market square, the railway buffet, the library, and the solicitor's office all appeared unchanged, yet the invisible lattice had shifted slightly. The town itself had, unknowingly, participated in the gathering of evidence. Purbright, sitting in the quiet of his office, understood that patience and careful reflection had positioned him to interpret the stranger's actions fully. The stage was prepared, the actors revealed in small gestures and private anxieties, and the moment of polite but decisive confrontation drew closer with each measured observation. The following morning, Purbright decided it was time to act with subtle precision. He had collected enough observations, traced enough minor inconsistencies, and reflected sufficiently on human nature to frame a test, one that would reveal the guilty party without alarm or spectacle. He instructed Baskerville to arrange a casual gathering at the railway buffet, ostensibly to discuss minor administrative matters with the local postmen and shopkeepers. In truth, it was a stage carefully prepared for the final act of observation. The stranger arrived, predictably polite, acknowledging familiar faces with the slightest of nods. Purbright, seated at a central table, allowed the conversation to meander toward matters of property, minor town disputes, and innocuous social grievances. The key, he understood, was to provoke a response without accusation, to suggest without asserting. The first clues appeared not in speech but in gesture, a fleeting glance toward the solicitor, a subtle tightening of the lips when the Hargreaves estate was mentioned, a momentary hesitation before answering a casual question about library records. Baskerville, following discreet cues, observed the stranger's reactions alongside Purbright. Each movement, each pause, each tiny adjustment of posture conveyed more than words could articulate. The townspeople, unaware of the careful scrutiny, contributed further evidence simply by being themselves. Mrs. Turpin, with her gentle exaggerations, Miss Pettigrew, with her compulsive note-taking, Mr. Flax, with his carefully modulated tones. All interacted under the invisible pressure of observation, revealing their own motives and inclinations in response to the stranger's presence. Purbright then introduced the critical element of his test, a casually phrased remark delivered to the group about the discovery of the package in the buffet. "I was intrigued to see something left unclaimed yesterday," he said, his tone neutral, almost conversational. "It appears someone has taken an interest in cataloguing our town's affairs, though to what purpose I cannot say. He allowed a pause, sipping his tea, while his gaze remained deliberately polite but firm on the stranger. The reaction was immediate, subtle, yet unmistakable. The stranger's hand, previously resting lightly on the table, twitched, as if unconsciously acknowledging recognition. His eyes flicked toward the ledger on which Purbright had made his own brief annotations, a micro-expression of concern crossing his otherwise composed face. The small, controlled adjustments of posture, the almost imperceptible tightening around the eyes, confirmed what Purbright had long suspected. The stranger had more than casual curiosity in Flaxborough, and the town's minor grievances and records were precisely the objects of his attention. Purbright allowed the conversation to drift onward, observing as the tension played out in manners and gestures. Eventually the stranger leaned forward slightly, almost imperceptibly, and offered an explanation in quiet, measured tones, admitting that he had been compiling records and observing behaviors, not for malicious purposes, but to uncover hidden disputes that might affect legal or financial matters in the town. His admissions were careful, polite, yet sufficient to satisfy Purbright's quiet curiosity and to reveal the truth without public embarrassment or disruption. By the time the meeting concluded, the lattice of minor clues, careful observation, and subtle behavioral cues had all aligned. The stranger had confirmed his own purpose, the townspeople had revealed their responses without malice, and Purbright, in his calm and unassuming way, had extracted the truth through patience, precision, and an understanding of human nature that rendered theatrics unnecessary. As the guests departed and the streets of Flaxborough returned to their familiar rhythm, Purbright leaned back in his chair, satisfied. The test had succeeded, the mystery clarified, and the subtle equilibrium of the town restored, its citizens unaware as ever of how closely their manners, habits, and minor anxieties had contributed to the revelation. The following morning, Purbright returned to his office with the quiet sense that the moment of revelation was near. The stranger's admissions at the railway buffet had clarified much, but the inspector knew that the full picture, the interweaving of minor grievances, subtle observations, and town-wide responses, needed to be calmly and comprehensively explained. He began arranging the sequence of his thoughts, each small clue placed in its proper context, ready for a civil yet conclusive presentation. He invited the key townspeople to a modest gathering in the solicitor's office: Mr. Flax, Miss Pettigrew, Miss Penhaligon, the vicar, and Mrs. Turpin. The stranger, now seated with the polite composure of one who has nothing to conceal, awaited the discussion with quiet interest. Purbright, as always, opened with measured politeness, reviewing the sequence of events in a tone that implied neither judgment nor dramatics. "As you are all aware," he began, "our town recently hosted a visitor whose actions have drawn attention." At first, the pattern seemed to suggest a single, tidy explanation involving local property and minor records. Yet, as we observed, additional subtleties emerged: footprints noted by the gardener, letters displaced at the market, and a package left at the railway buffet. Each of these was minor, seemingly trivial, but taken together they form a lattice of intention and response. He paused, allowing the weight of observation to settle gently over his listeners. It is in these small details that the stranger's purpose becomes clear. He is not a person of malice, nor one intent on deception for personal gain. Rather, he has been documenting the town's minor disputes, property irregularities, and subtle grievances, not to punish or exploit, but to understand and perhaps to advise in the broader context of law and propriety. Purbright turned his attention to the stranger. "Your meticulous cataloguing and careful observation have unintentionally revealed more about Flaxborough itself than you could have anticipated. Each person here, through natural reactions and minor expressions, has contributed to the understanding you sought, and indeed to the understanding we now possess. He then addressed the assembled townspeople in turn, linking each minor incident, hesitation, and unspoken tension to the broader story. Miss Pettigrew's detailed notes, Miss Penhaligon's ledger observation, Mrs. Turpin's attentiveness to small irregularities, Mr. Flax's discreet concern over boundaries, and the vicar's sensitivity to records. All had interacted with the stranger's presence to form a network of subtle truths. Purbright's explanation was careful, polite, and entirely civil. There was no scandal, no public shaming, only a recognition of human nature and the quiet truths beneath social politeness. When he finished, a soft, appreciative murmur circulated among the group. The stranger nodded, acknowledging the accuracy of Purbright's deductions without embarrassment, while the townspeople absorbed the revelation with a mixture of relief and mild wonder at the level of insight so calmly conveyed. Flaxborough, in its ordinary rhythms, had been quietly examined, understood, and gently corrected, all without the upheaval of drama or accusation. Purbright leaned back in his chair, satisfied. The lattice of small clues, human reactions, and subtle observations had yielded clarity. The town's equilibrium, delicate but resilient, had been preserved. Citizens would return to their routines with only a faint awareness of the careful scrutiny they had collectively experienced, and the stranger, having completed his purpose, would take his leave quietly, as he had arrived, without fuss, without fanfare, leaving only the invisible traces of observation behind. By the following morning, Flaxborough had settled into its accustomed rhythm, though an almost imperceptible shift lingered in the air. The minor unease and curiosity the stranger had provoked had left its trace, a quiet attentiveness in everyday exchanges that went unnoticed by all but the most observant. Purbright, however, recognized the subtle evidence of change. The town's social fabric had been examined, its small tensions catalogued, and its civility quietly tested. He invited the key participants to his office for a final discussion, not a confrontation, but a polite unveiling of the intricate pattern he had traced. With measured calm, he reviewed the chain of minor events, gestures, and observations that had formed the backbone of the investigation. The displaced letter, the footprint that hinted at careful navigation, the package in the railway buffet, and the repeated pauses that betrayed the stranger's meticulous attention. Each detail, trivial in isolation, had contributed to a lattice of understanding, one that revealed both the visitor's intent and the town's own unspoken habits. "The stranger," Purbright began, addressing the room with his characteristic politeness, "has not acted with malice, nor with a desire to deceive. His interest has been in understanding the undercurrents of our town, the subtle disputes, minor grievances, and patterns of behavior that we so carefully maintain under the veneer of civility. Yet it is through his presence that we, too, have observed ourselves more clearly. Each hesitation, each unguarded glance has contributed to the complete picture." He proceeded to link each small clue to its natural cause: the solicitor's careful phrasing and mild discomfort over property boundaries, the gardener's furtive comments about greenhouse bulbs, Miss Pettigrew's meticulous notes, and Mrs. Turpin's attentiveness to arrangements in the market square. Each had, in responding to the stranger, revealed a facet of the town's intricate social order. Purbright explained the significance without accusation, his tone gentle, almost conversational, leaving space for comprehension rather than embarrassment. When he concluded, the room fell into polite silence. The stranger acknowledged the accuracy of the deductions, admitting quietly that he had indeed been cataloguing observations to understand disputes that might affect legal and social proprieties. The townspeople, meanwhile, felt a mixture of relief and mild fascination. There was no scandal, no need for public reckoning, only the recognition that their behaviours, however subtle, had contributed to an unexpected clarity. As the visitors departed, the streets of Flaxborough resumed their familiar cadence. Shops opened and closed, letters were delivered, and neighbours exchanged the usual greetings, yet the town carried forward a faint, refined awareness, a residual echo of the observation, analysis, and gentle testing it had quietly endured. Purbright returned to his office, reviewed his notes, and permitted himself a moment of satisfaction. The case, delicate yet illuminating, had been resolved without disruption or spectacle. Every subtle clue had found its place, every observation had led to understanding, and the town's equilibrium had been preserved. Flaxborough had been examined, its small-scale intrigues revealed and reconciled, all under the calm, unassuming scrutiny of its patient inspector. Purbright, finally closing his notebook, allowed the quiet to settle. Outside, the market square bustled as usual, the railway buffet hummed with gentle activity, and the vicar's bell tolled in the distance. All was ordinary, yet now subtly illuminated by the lens of careful observation and polite inquiry.